Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Stepfather 2, Make Room for Daddy, and dear God, I don't know whose idea was it to give it that subtitle, but that subtitle just sounds wrong on so many levels. Now, Stepfather 2 was released in 1989, and this, of course, is the sequel to the 1987 classic, The Stepfather. Now, the film was directed by Jeff Burr, who also directed films like From a Whisper to a Scream, and Pumpkinhead 2, Blood Wings, and Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, and he also directed Puppet Master 4 and 5. Now, this was originally going to be released straight to video, but the producers felt it was strong enough to get a limited theatrical release, but to be honest, I was not surprised when I found out that this was originally a straight-to-video movie, because honestly, it feels straight-to-video. And I'm not necessarily saying that as if it's a bad thing. There are actually some really good direct-to-video horror films from around this time period. The issue with this movie is really that it's a sequel to The Stepfather. The first movie is a genuinely really good and well-made psychological horror film. This one really does feel more like a cheap slasher film, and it's even shot more like a slasher film, whereas the first one was shot like a psychological suspense film. Now, Stepfather 2, my opinions on this movie are honestly very mixed. Like, it's not a bad movie per se, it's just a very, in my opinion, it's a very bland, mediocre film. I mean, it is well made for the kind of film that it is, but I do think Jeff Burr is a good director. But it's clear that they're not taking it as seriously this time around. It's a slasher film, whereas the first one was trying to be a little bit of a cut above. This one, it is what it is. It's a cheap direct-to-video slasher film, even though technically it's not direct-to-video because it did get a limited theatrical run. It was shot as a direct-to-video film, so I'm counting it as a direct-to-video film. I would say the movie's biggest crime is that it's forgettable, but to be honest, sometimes that's the worst thing a movie can be. Like, I would almost rather this movie be all sorts of bad just so I could remember some of it. Now, the plot of Stepfather 2 is it's set sometime after the events of the first movie. Now, the first movie, spoiler if you haven't seen it yet, ended where his stepdaughter stabbed him in the chest. But in this movie, you find out that he somehow survived that. So, in this movie, he's locked up at a psychiatric hospital, and long story short, he manages to escape. So he once again changes his identity, and now he's posing as a therapist named Dr. Jean Clifford. But in the movie, he ends up seducing the real estate agent who sells him the house that he's living in throughout most of the movie, a woman named Carol, who is a divorcee. And really, the basic plot of the movie is it's about him trying to marry this woman and start a new life with her, but he's willing to kill anybody who gets in his way or starts to realize that he's not what he claims to be. And that's the basic plotline of Stepfather 2, and I'll at least give the movie some credit. It's not a complete repeat of the plot of the first one, so at least the movie has that going for it. Now, in the movie, Terry O'Quinn reprises his role as the stepfather, even though he never actually becomes a stepfather in this movie. The woman he's trying to marry does have a son, but he never actually becomes a stepfather to this boy. And he, of course, is great in the movie. In the movie, Meg Foster plays Carol, the woman who eventually becomes Jean's fiancée, and she's also really good in this movie. Now, Meg Foster is a great actress, but her fucking eyes, man. I know there's a lot of jokes about Meg Foster's eyes, but for some reason in this movie, they were really freaking me out. Maybe it's because I watched the movie on VHS, so maybe that softer quality emphasized her eyes. In the movie, Jonathan Brandis plays Todd, Jean's potential stepson. Now, some people might recognize Jonathan Brandis as the younger Bill Denbrough from the 1990 adaptation of Stephen King's It. He's actually really good in this movie, but he was a good actor, and it's a shame he's no longer with us. And then you have Caroline Williams, who you might recognize from stuff like Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 and Leprechaun 3. She plays Carol's friend Maddie, who starts to realize that Jean is not all he claims to be. I will say the acting in the movie is actually pretty good across the board. But besides the acting, the movie really doesn't have a lot going for it, at least not in my opinion. Once again, it's not a bad movie. For me personally, it was just kind of a mediocre film. I will say the ending sequence, which takes place at Carol and Jean's wedding, is actually a really well done horror scene. And the movie does have some pretty funny scenes, like there's a scene towards the beginning of the film while Jean is posing as this therapist, and he's counseling a bunch of women who are having issues with their husbands, and this one woman starts talking about how her husband makes her hum whenever she gives him a blowjob, but she's trying not to say blowjob, and Jean is not getting what she's saying. But again, it's clear that they're not taking it as seriously as the first one. But while Stepfather 2 is not a great movie, I will say this film is fucking Dawn of the Dead compared to the next film in this franchise, Stepfather 3, which will be my next movie review.